Microphone on? Thanks. Good morning. Thank you for having me. I'm so pleased to be here. It is really nice. Okay, well, I'll get right into it. So all of us understand, I think, that we're really on one of those turning points in history, right? I mean, when they write books in the future about where we are today, it is going to be big. And, you know, the two events happened in 2010 which really highlighted the implications for national security, as well as for many other things, of cybersecurity, cyber attacks, cyber defense, and we're going to look at them today, which is WikiLeaks and Stuxnet. So I tried to frame it in a way that we could look at it from a historical perspective. Could you turn on the counter so I could see the time? And so what we're looking at is an old adage, right? In fact, old adage is redundant. Adage means that it's time-honored wisdom, yeah? And so it's something that has been handed down to us for centuries that comes to be accepted as truth. And so these are some characters from history. Euripides on the top left said that the tongue is mightier than the blade. Muhammad talked about how the ink of the scholar is mightier or stronger than the blood of the martyr. Napoleon said that 4 hostile newspapers are more to be feared than 1,000 bayonets. Thomas Jefferson in our country said that you should do in the future with the pen what people used to do with the sword. Shakespeare said that those who carry rapiers or swords sometimes fear those with goose quills or pins more than anything else. And then St. Paul there in the middle, he said that the Word of God is so powerful that it even splits the soul and the spirit. Right? So all that to say that there's a lot coming down to us saying that words are more powerful than weapons. What I want to do is use that sort of as a tool through which we can look at cybersecurity and what's going on around us today. I pressed the button on the machine. So the information revolution. Obviously, all of those gentlemen lived before computers, right? And computers have changed everything. So on the top left, we have the difference engine of Charles Babbage that was designed in 1837 and wasn't even built until 1991, right? Because it was so far ahead of its time. So a mechanical calculator that, in fact, is more powerful than the average electronic calculator that you buy today in a store. On the right, the ENIAC, or the electric numerical integrator and calculator, which was built in World War II to calculate military firing tables. And the UNIVAC, just after it, after World War II, with just 1% sample of the American population, correctly predicted the U.S. presidential election after the war. So quickly it was seen that information technology is going to take us to a new level. Now, the development of the personal computer, of course, puts all of this power in your hands and in my hands. So a PC is a serious research and development generator, right? An idea generator, a game changer. And each of us now can own one for pretty cheap. But even that was blown away by connecting all these things together, right? So you put all these things together, and you've got a big global brain that we can all tap into now, and really processing power, all those things you used to worry about when you bought a machine are much less important today than the reliability of your internet connection. That's the key thing, right? You want a good, unfiltered, reliable connection to the internet in order to guarantee your place in history and your opportunity to affect history even, right? And so what I want to think about also from the standpoint of the internet being everywhere, is its amplification power, and the fact that you can push things out as far on the planet, and you can reach out and touch things via the internet, and it has implications for everything, including weapons, how we sort of attack people. So rockets and airplanes, they cross national borders. And that was after artillery, could jump over the front line of battle. And then intercontinental ballistic missiles can go anywhere on planet Earth. But now you have the internet, which sort of allows you to reach out and touch anywhere on the globe that is internet connected. And really, that's just about everywhere today. So from a historical perspective, you can imagine that anybody from a student to a soldier, a spy, a politician, etc., they have enormous power in their hands simply by reaching out and speaking to or manipulating a smaller audience, a bigger audience. And you can imagine a propagandist today has the power to put their story in everyone's living room today. And also, this means that even the smallest person on the planet can ruin the day of a president or prime minister, right, simply by telling a story that is contradictory to a party line or to what was the goal of a particular mission or a war even. So I want to tie this into current events. This is sort of my thing. I feel like you always need to tie these things into current events to make them relevant and see how in fact real world is affecting and being affected by all of these cyber and cybersecurity affairs. So Syria, as you know, today is undergoing they're in the middle of a revolution, say. So we're watching it transpire on a daily basis, and this is not new. So in 1982, there was also an uprising in this city called Hama. And these are from two books, From Beirut to Jerusalem by Thomas Friedman and Pity the Nation by Robert Fisk, and these two quotes. But basically, no one was around in 1982 but the inhabitants of Hama to see what happened, right? So the government came in and killed, up to 40,000 people, leveled the town. I was there in 1988, so I visited Syria and just really grew to love it. And there's no more friendlier people or better food in the world. And so I'm walking down the main street in Hama, and this guy comes up to me, and he walks alongside me, and he's looking at the ground, and he's talking, and he's telling me everything that happened in 1982. How many people they killed and what happened and the story and so on and so forth as we're walking along for fear, obviously, of being arrested. So it's so different in 2011. All you have to do is go to YouTube and to search, and you find no end of evidence for what's going on today. Now, from a historical perspective, this is, it couldn't be bigger, because the hope for all of us should be that this technology to record and to not only amplify what's happening on the ground, but also to pull back what's happening from anywhere else on the globe. So the push and pull of the internet, you can contribute to and take from it, hopefully will lead to more transparency, accountability of government, so on and so forth. And we're really witnessing that, I think, in Syria today. Now, in Syria today, so YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, basically those pages are available for Syrian citizens to go to, but anything with a secure login is not. So you can search for videos right now on YouTube, but you can't watch them, for instance, or you can't log in to Twitter. So that was an example of the pen, of WikiLeaks, say, and the ability to tell a story or to read a story. Now, when you think about weapons and military targeting and military destruction and so on and so forth, for a long time in the United States, there's been this question about whether an electronic or digital Pearl Harbor is even theoretically possible. But I suspect that we've already had numerous electronic Pearl Harbors. It's just that you know, they look different and they feel different, and you may not know it for a while. So this, in 2007, you can see the alleged nuclear reactor in Syria that they were building clandestinely. You know, it was there one day and it was not the next because the Israeli Air Force came in and destroyed it. So it's widely suspected that a cyber attack played a role in turning off the Syrian air defense before the jets crossed the border to bomb the plant. And of course the details would be highly classified, but you can only imagine that this is not only possible, but it's entirely probable today, because, you know, just think about it. All of this stuff takes place via computer, right? Finding missiles or planes, you know, tracking them, attempting to hit them with anti-aircraft battery. The corporal has to communicate with the sergeant, and the sergeant has to communicate with the captain, and the captain has to call the national security establishment, so on and so forth. All of those things are done by computer. And so any one of those points, you know, if the Israeli military had studied their adversary and found where they could conduct a denial of service attack at the right time. The thing I think about cyber attacks is a couple of things. One, you know, there's a lot of naysayers about cyber attacks, and I hope they're right, and I hope we don't have as much to fear as we could. But one, a cyber attack is more or less a means to an end, right? It's not an end in itself, and it's just, you know, I get control of a computer, and you know, what is that computer, and the person who normally sits at that desk, what do they have access to, and what do they do? And then the second thing is timing, right? If you get a hold of the right computer, and you know, you think about when to strike, you know. You know, with a denial of service attack, you could say, well, I could get my website back up in an hour, no problem. But if it's in a military context, getting your site back up in an hour, you know, the operation may be over at that point in time. So this, in August, was the Syrian Ministry of Defense homepage. So I'm going to read it to you because I think it's really powerful stuff. So obviously this is an anonymous defacement. But to the Syrian people, the world stands with you against the brutal regime of Bashar al-Assad. Know that time and history are on your side. Tyrants use violence because they have nothing else, and the more violent they are, the more fragile they become. We salute your determination to be nonviolent in the face of the regime's brutality and admire your willingness to pursue justice, not mere revenge. All tyrants will fall, and thanks to your bravery, Bashar al-Assad is next. To the Syrian military, you are responsible for protecting the Syrian people, and anyone who orders you to kill women, children, and the elderly deserves to be tried for treason. No outside enemy could do as much damage to Syria as Bashar al-Assad has done. Defend your country, rise up against the regime. Anonymous. Right? I mean, this is impressive. This is not only a group with hacker skills, but they're following current events, and they are attempting to impact history. And so this is a beautiful example of a non-state actor who is able to interact with heads of state, right? We saw this already in 1999 when NATO had an intervention over Kosovo. There was non-state hackers that were attempting to degrade NATO military operations. And already in 1999, they had some modest successes. During the course of the campaign, NATO was forced to hire new people, to buy all new machines. There was tons of virus-infected email that overloaded their system, and they couldn't send email. Sites were down. And you can see how, you know, even first-tier, you know, national security establishments can be affected by unknown non-state actors in cyberspace. And so this is really important. This is somewhere in the middle between WikiLeaks and Stuxnet, I think. You know, this is not just pushing information out. This is not just demonstrating vulnerabilities in machines, but it's actually, to some degree, an attack, right? You are manipulating not only data, but because we all live in cyberspace now, and our lives are affected by what we're reading on the screen, this is affecting the real world. So I just got back from 4 years in Estonia, where I was the U.S. representative to the NATO Cyber Center there. And I was lucky. I got to be the first international there, and now they're up to 10 countries. But since I was there, basically, NATO has gone from almost no interest in cyber to an overwhelming interest in cyber. So they have these strategic documents that they publish every couple of years, and every 10 years they do a strategic concept for the alliance. So already in 1999, it's not so long ago. Think how far we've come in such a short period of time. So that was the strategic concept that was written in 1999. It wasn't changed until 2010. But in 1999, so there was absolutely, if you search the document, there is no mention of not only of hacker or cyber attack, but no mention of cyber, no mention of computer, no mention of network. So it wasn't even, 10 years ago, the national security thinkers of the foremost, political military alliance on the planet was not even thinking about computers. So in 2002, they start thinking about defending. Then they forget about it again. Then they think about developing. Then after the incident in Estonia in 2007, they talk about cyber attacks. And then by 2010, this is the new strategic concept. So Madeleine Albright, former U.S. Secretary of State, led a group that was advising NATO prior to the rewriting of the strategic concept in 2010. And what they advised NATO was the 3 top threats to NATO in the next 10 years would be ballistic missiles, terrorism, and, you guessed it, cyber attacks. So eventually, this is the wording. They said cyber attacks now have crossed the threshold where they threaten Euro-Atlantic prosperity, security, and stability. And then goes into some detail about how to address the threat, getting the organization under some level of monitoring and control and defense, and then also thinking about how to use cyber in order to achieve political and military objectives. So the 2 things we're looking at, WikiLeaks and Stuxnet, I think, both of them have implications for national security in very different ways, right? WikiLeaks is about taking something and pushing it up, right? It doesn't matter what it is. I mean, if it's good, people are going to be interested. But essentially it's using the amplification power of the internet, right? And if you've got a good story to tell, you've got a good picture you've taken, you can put it in everyone's living room today. And this is amazing. And this is why I think national security thinkers have to be on guard today, because you never know what is going to be in the news tomorrow. Stuxnet is different in that it's reaching out from anywhere on the planet down into any particular rabbit hole, right? Now that can be, a former spouse, it can be a head of state, or it can be a nuclear program on the other side of the planet. And so that's fundamentally entirely possible, right? Because of the connectivity that exists, if you do enough reconnaissance, you can reach out and put your hand in any particular hat and pull out a rabbit. And I think that's exactly what happened with Stuxnet. So let's talk first about WikiLeaks. I think WikiLeaks is significant impact. But part of it, though, is similar to sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? It's the idea that this is forbidden information, or this wasn't meant for me, or this is seductive and new, there's a big element of that. A lot of the WikiLeaks documents are really not so interesting. They're very mundane, in fact. And in fact, many publications have much better analysis in writing and explanations than do the documents in WikiLeaks. However, what Julian Assange and Bradley Manning did was offer us a peek behind the government curtain, right? You know, because you can always say, well, academics and journalists, they don't know everything, right? Only the government knows, and so you could always blame your favorite periodical for not being well enough informed. But surely the government knows. Surely the government has all the answers, right? Well, in fact, I think that's one of the important things about WikiLeaks is to realize that this is another source, but don't confuse it with the truth, right? It's just another source, and you have to be very careful. So a lot of it goes to trust, right? How do you evaluate trust? And, you know, eventually it goes back to you individually. It's all up to you, right? You know, whether you believe what you see and what you read is real. So a lot of people in this room, you'd love to get published in Springer, right? Why is that? It's because they publish the most articles in computers and computer security, and they have the most articles, I believe, in a lot of the academic databases today. So they publish so many journals, but it's well respected. Cell, on the other hand, I noticed was the highest number of citations per article. So that's a little bit different, right? If you really want your article, and of course you might not be in this field, you know, but you'd like to find a journal that has the highest level of credibility, right? So in that sense, you know, say Foreign Affairs is a little bit more up my alley. I would love to get an article published in Foreign Affairs. But even Foreign Affairs, the more articles you read, the more you realize they're just written by real people, normal people like you and me, with an opinion. So, you know, The Economist, for instance, a couple years ago, I had a couple interviews with The Economist, and then, you know, I didn't get a quote in there, and I thought, oh my goodness, you must have to really be something to get into The Economist. Well, last year, then I was interviewed twice by The Economist, and both times quotes made it in, right? And so I thought, wow, that's great, but that's kind of strange, you know, it's just me, right? It's just me with an opinion, so I don't know. I feel a little bit like Groucho Marx, right? Groucho Marx, famous comedian, and he said, I would never join a club that would have me as a member, right? And so a little bit about that, you know, by the time you actually achieve something you had wanted, then you realize that in fact, well, it might not be perfect. Think about the, you know, China, Russia, and the U.S., right? If you ask them, who do you trust, you know, there's a nationalistic, a patriotic aspect to that question. You're going to defend your own language, your own thinkers, and that's going to play a role in whom you trust. In our country, I was very sad to see an article. Now, evidently this has changed, but a couple of years ago anyway, in fact, the most trusted news source in the United States was Fox News, which when you watch Fox News, you realize that it is so emotional and so short-sighted when you watch a lot of their talks. You're shocked that it could be. But in fact, that's what the truth was. So with Julian Assange, of course, he's giving you these documents, right, which are, you know, a lot, let's just say they're stolen. That's my belief anyway, right? Okay, they were offered, but they're intellectual property. I mean, if I belong to a company, I can't really take the intellectual property of that company and post it unless I have a really, really strong reason to do so. And I understand the whistleblower concept, but in general, I think that a team of 5 or 6 reviewers at WikiLeaks is insufficient to review the wide range of documents and that are available to them, and we'll get to that in just a second. But one of the important aspects of computer networks today are that even as the most junior employee of your organization, you can have an impact, right? And so this is great. It makes the world much more egalitarian, which is really cool. However, In this case, so you have Mafia Boy in the middle, right? And I like to use him as an example because as a 15-year-old kid, I mean, a 15-year-old is a child, right? Was able to bring down Dell and Amazon and some of the biggest companies online just before he went off to school for the day. Bradley Manning on the left essentially had access to, 500,000, 1 million classified documents and was able just to, remove them from the network and hand them on to the world. Aldrich Ames on the right was a CIA employee, and he was already a spy. He got moved back from Rome, Italy to CIA headquarters, and he sat down at his desk, and this is back before they probably had very smart internal divisions on the network, and he essentially had access to everything, right? So he started passing on to the Russians, the whole double agent file of the CIA. And so he had access to all this information that he had no knowledge of, no business knowing about, but he was able to pass it on. And that's just the power of, having access to the network. And this is going to be a real challenge. I heard a great talk by a Dutch general who just got back. He was in charge in southern Afghanistan. And so one of the aspects of his talk, he said that there was just way too much classification in the military, such that you can't, if you try to classify everything, you classify nothing. So he gave an example, and he said, did you know that the weather in the military is classified? He said, I could never pass on the weather to anyone in Afghanistan because it was classified. He said, the problem is that everything is classified, and so the standards drop so low for the millions of documents. He said, one of the things that militaries really need to think about are what are the really crucial aspects that need to be classified and separate them out. So there are some examples. If you extrapolate this into more of a macro level, you can see that organizations offer a lot more than individuals even. Here you have the Turkish and Greek hackers that even within the NATO alliance are doing battle in cyberspace. You have not only Anonymous, but you have the Electronic Disturbance Theater, which believes that you have to say who you are and why you're doing what you do. And that you created this tool in order to effect this change in the world. You have, within countries, you have hackers that are hacking their own government. And, even within the state of Texas, you could have a pro-Israeli and a pro-Palestinian hacker engaged in Middle East conflict, from their homes in the United States. Cult of the Dead Cow actually coined the term hacktivism in 1994. So these things, in fact, are not so new, but they have taken some time to percolate and to come into our collective consciousness. So with all the documents that WikiLeaks has provided us, one of the questions I think that's really important to ask is what have they told us? What impact have they had at a strategic level, at a high level, at a national security level? And there's all kinds of tactical things we've seen. I saw recently, if you saw in the news, that in South Korea, they lost a laptop a couple of weeks ago. And this laptop had really sensitive information on it. It had basically all the battle plans for the South Korean Air Force in the event of conflict. Every possible battle plan. And so, they're thinking now, how do we figure out how to, to recalculate all these battle plans? It's going to take a lot of time and effort, and it may not even be possible because we're going to come up with the same battle plans that took us years to derive in the first place. So that's an example of a tactical failure that could have strategic implications. There was a paper written by the University of Colorado, published this year, that looked at the 77,000 documents that WikiLeaks published relative to Afghanistan. So they put all those documents into a database, and then with the specific goal of trying to see whether the story they told is different from what the politicians have been telling us. And their conclusion was that at the strategic level, they did not. They said that essentially the 77,000 documents on Afghanistan were a great catalog of military tactics, especially for military buffs and historians. But they looked at casualties, they looked at locations, they looked at weapons, etc. But from a strategic perspective, they said they only told us what we already knew. The insurgency was intensifying, it was spreading, and the number of casualties was rising. I've been thinking about this, and part of it is that from a strategic perspective, I'm starting to assume that there is very little that you could actually classify, right? Because it's too big, it's too important, there are too many data points, right? If the question and the answer are strategic in nature and strategic in scope, tactical things are great to classify. You know, you probably know I'm going to attack you, but you have no idea when, with what forces, what conditions, what weather, that sort of thing. Those are things that are great to classify, right? Sun Tzu would really recommend that, that I classify, what time of day I intend to attack you. But the strategic questions, these are much harder because they require so many data points. So I'm trying to think about this, and so what I did was I went into the Internet Movie Database, right? And I started looking for research done on it. This is just 1/100th of the 77,000 documents that WikiLeaks gave us on Afghanistan. And I wondered how many of them are extraordinary. And so I couldn't read all 77,000 documents, but what I thought is that IMDb might tell us something about this. And so the green on here, these are 6s. So the average score in IMDb is 6.2. So I said, okay, all 6s, anything between 6 and 7 is green. Anything 5 and 7, I'll make yellow. And everything else is red, right? So just the middle there is green and yellow, and everything else is red. And so, this is imperfect, obviously. But what it does is it shows you where the outliers are. There was a good book written a couple years ago called Outliers. And I don't know if you read it, but it was all about what makes the Beatles, and what makes a regular group a regular group. Right? And so there's some really good aspects to the book. A lot of things, too much to go into. But Miyazaki's only come along every so often, right? Most movies I hate, and I can't even sit down and watch a movie. But the Miyazaki movies, like Spirited Away, etc., if you've seen them, you can watch them over and over again, right? And over. And that's why score is very high. Jean-Claude Van Damme came in just under the radar in terms of bad. But I figure, that we also have really good politicians and really bad politicians. And so if you look at this from the macro level, I did a paper a few years ago with Roelof Temming, who is also, I think, a sponsor of this conference, the founder of SensePost in Pitserva. And he talks a lot about the bell curve. And most people are somewhere in the middle, but these extremes out here you've got to watch out for. These are the significant things, and these are the red squares on here. They're either good or bad. But one of the things I want to say is that I think WikiLeaks could tell us a lot about tactics, but maybe not so much about strategy. WikiLeaks also has a couple of problems. So one of them is its internal disarray, right? He's lost a lot of friends, Julian Assange, over what he's doing. In particular, how he's doing it. And some of it is really related to sources. And so with just 5 or 6 people reviewing these documents before publishing them online, you can't expect that they have the expertise to deal with all this information in the first place. However, when you look at, for instance, the Taliban have confirmed that they've used WikiLeaks to find spies within their organization. We had a reporter from Ethiopia who just had to flee his country because of WikiLeaks and because he was outed as a source. And in this case, we have Zimbabwe. So WikiLeaks and Anonymous, etc., they work against Zimbabwe actively. However, in this case, when they publish the WikiLeaks documents, basically there's a lot of source information in there that puts lives at risk, right? So this is an example of how anything can be taken to a fault. Chocolate, etc. Publishing all this information without removing the sources, without really thinking about what you're doing in each individual case can really put lives in danger. And so you can clearly see this is a Zimbabwe government op-ed in a newspaper a few weeks ago, basically saying, we will investigate and take decisive disciplinary action. And this is from a government who, according to Amnesty International, commits torture, and no one has ever brought to account for it. So let's switch our attention to Stuxnet. So, I'm sure there's science fiction fans in the crowd, and Stuxnet is an example of, Arthur Clarke's third rule that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, right? So this is just code, right? Even a few years ago, you can't imagine. Put yourself in the shoes of a Iranian nuclear weapons program technician, right? And your equipment self-destructs before your eyes. But the monitor, the screen, is telling you that everything is normal, everything is fine, right? This is essentially what happened. And so the code that was in the system was bad, right? And so we know from the history of computer security, that it is entirely possible to infect and to subvert a compiler so that everything that gets compiled with that program in the future has a backdoor, right? It's simply a fact. It has been proven over and over again. So what can you trust? This goes back to, probably our thoughts on WikiLeaks, but can you trust your code? So I've been in the Beltway for a long time. That's the DC area. And there used to be this famous anecdote about the NSA, and the National Security Agency, their hackers put together just 100 lines of code, and they passed it around the Beltway for various agencies to look at, and no one could find all of the Easter eggs and all of the vulnerabilities and all of the intentional weaknesses in 100 lines of code, right? So in the 20 million lines of code that belong to Windows, most of which are dead code or not even doing anything anymore, how in the world can you secure this? And just as Bruce Schneier likes to say, these things are too complex to secure computers, right? Very hard. So this, in fact, is the new sword. If you just look at the facts surrounding the program, it's hard to come to any other conclusion than this is a first of its kind, an example of a computer network attack that we have not seen before. Some of the debate today is over whether this would be difficult to pull off again. You have Ralph Langner. We brought him up to Estonia recently for a talk. Terrific speaker. And he believes that this could be repackaged and used again in unknown circumstances in the future. And I've seen other experts online say that's unrealistic, and this was so difficult to pull off, and you need so much intelligence on your target, and so on and so forth. It's not going to happen, at least very easily. However, look at the basic aspects, just the top two for what I would call military-grade quality of this program. So you have to test it on real infrastructure, right? That all of a sudden takes the number of possible authors down to a very small circle, right? Not all of us in the room possess a nuclear centrifuge at home on which to test our code. The second thing is the first programmable logic controller rootkit, right? So that the code is hidden and the technicians see that everything is normal, right? These are two things that really separate Stuxnet from everything else. Now, you always have to look at context, right? People don't do anything in a vacuum, and Stuxnet is no different. Now, if Stuxnet was so difficult to pull off, it must be that it was written for a very important reason, right? And somebody felt a high level of urgency to effect this operation and to try and alter the course of history even, right? Because this is, I'm going to argue, this is a strategic weapon, Stuxnet, right? So just think about it. The Israeli Air Force has destroyed a nuclear facility in Iraq in 1981, in Syria in 2007. And these are events that risked not only international censure. Even in 1981, when they attacked Iraq, the United States was furious. And newspapers in the United States described it as terrorism, right? So this was a big, big deal that involved high risks especially for Israel and Iraq and the Middle East, because you're risking a wider war, right? But the pilots, when they flew back from Iraq to Israel, I saw this yesterday, they were quoting scripture from the Old Testament, from the Jewish Bible. And so don't underestimate the context within which all of this lies, because you don't have to read much about the history of Israel and their national security thinking to understand that they believe they are living on a knife's edge and it could all end tomorrow, right? That's for sure. So cyber wars that we have seen to date, I don't think make the cut, even from the standpoint of evaluating WikiLeaks. And so we looked at Georgia, which is kind of a military case model, Estonia, the movement of this statue across town. This is a political business case model, right? Estonia, essentially, you took away their banking and their media for a short period of time, sort of exposing their level of relying on the internet to vulnerability. The Chechens, if you haven't followed this story, they are brilliant at propaganda, and ever since the beginning of the World Wide Web, they have used the internet in order to show their conflict with Russia and to raise money and to bring money back to the field of battle. In the United States, there is an obsession with Chinese hackers. And so that's where most of the focus from the Pentagon is, on this massive loss of data to China, or the perceived loss of data. Almost for sure it's not all China, but it's a big internet space there that anyone could operate through. Myanmar on the left, you know, when they had the crackdown in 2007 on pro-democracy protesters, they decided just to unplug the internet for 2 weeks. Right? So we always talk about borders in cyberspace or the lack of borders, but in fact I think there are all kinds of borders that can be manipulated. And then in the Middle East conflict, this is a terrific example. This is when there were 3 Israeli soldiers kidnapped in Lebanon in 2000, and so the Israelis, pro-Israeli hackers, they hit the Hezbollah website, right? And it was a powerful enough attack that it was difficult for Hezbollah to get rid of. And then they found, when they tried to change their URL, all spellings of Hezbollah and various misspellings had already been bought up by someone before the attack took place. So if you look at the Arab-Israeli conflict, it is a great example also of the means to an end concept of cyber attacks, in that very often pro-Israeli hackers will hit sites of political and military significance, but pro-Palestinian hackers will go right to the target of the Israeli economy. And every time there's a flare-up in the Middle East, hundreds of Israeli businesses will go offline. So, talk a little bit about, you know, the amplification power of the internet pushing things out. But here's another way to look at it that distinguishes Stuxnet from historical worms. So, other examples, you know, let's see how many machines and how quickly we can compromise them in order to accomplish a goal. Stuxnet, again, it's backwards, it's opposite, right? It's let's find this particular target. So, and this target was, you know, a PLC that controlled nuclear centrifuges in Iran, right? And so the damage could have been much greater. It wasn't a criminal organization that's looking for your credit card numbers. It's finding something very, very specific out there. And again, it makes it a very high-value target, especially considering all of the resources that were put into to develop the program. So here's the target, the Siemens PLC. And so what is a PLC? I mean, you think about it, they were developed in the automotive industry, right? Because you had people, you know, starting to mass-produce cars. And then, you know, they wanted to bring in information technology in order to speed this process up, right? You want to make it more efficient. You want to make more of a profit for your company. And so then you bring in equipment that can spray a car black or red or white. But then the PLC, what does it do? Because when they first brought that technology in, then when you wanted to switch from a white car to a red car, you actually had to bring in the welders and the electricians, and they had to unplug everything, replug different equipment in order to do it. And the PLC is meant to bridge that gap. You know, you can actually program via software, switching it from a red to a white car. And so it is an industrial device. It's a computer that can withstand high temperatures, vibration, essentially industrial, environmental considerations. The target then is the centrifuge. So in this case of Stuxnet. Basically, the light blue and the dark blue dots, these are uranium-235 and uranium-238. You want the 235, right? If you take natural uranium, uranium-235 is, I think it's 0.7%, right? Uranium-238 is like 99%. So what you want to do is enrich the uranium in a centrifuge. So a centrifuge is sort of, it can separate anything, right? It spins, and the heavier material falls, and the lighter material rises. And so it can separate cream from milk, for instance. And so the uranium-235 rises, you scoop it out, and then you enrich the uranium. It takes a long time. It takes thousands of centrifuges to enrich uranium from that 0.7% just to 3 or 3.5% such that you can use it in a reactor. But you have to enrich the uranium all the way to over 90%, which takes a lot of time and effort in order to develop a nuclear weapon. And these centrifuges, they are so sensitive that even fingerprints left on them can destroy the machine during the process, right? So what the Stuxnet code did was, so these are supposed to turn at about 1,000 hertz, right? And the Stuxnet code, then while it was telling the engineers that everything was okay, it raised the speed to about 1.4 thousand hertz, right? And then 27 days later, it lowered it to a few hundred hertz, all the while telling the engineers that it was on target at 1,000. This was sufficient to destroy the machine, right? Because the parts couldn't take this pressure. It forced the parts into contact with each other such that the machine would be destroyed. Anyway, a former IAEA weapons inspector recently said, just a couple weeks ago in an interview, that he believes about 2,000 centrifuges were destroyed in Iran. One of the big questions about Stuxnet is why not more, why not less? Who knows? Maybe the op wasn't successful. Maybe it was. Maybe the Iranians aren't telling us everything, or maybe they're telling us stuff we want to hear, right? So with a lot of these intelligence questions, you never really know the full truth, but these are some of the things we do know from analysis and reverse engineering of the code. So the air gap, right? Well, obviously, a nuclear weapons program is not connected to the internet, right? Obviously. Well, is anything never really connected to the internet, right? Because, that code had to get there in the first place. There's supply chain intervention, which intelligence services are capable of. There's insider threat. But then also you have to move the data back and forth for it to be of any value to anybody, right? So the air gap means that physically, electrically, and electromagnetically, you want to separate a network from an untrusted network, right? So in all those ways, it can't be emitting, beyond a certain level. It can't be connected to the same electrical infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So there are all kinds of ways that a bad guy might connect an unconnected network. However, even with the most air-gap network, you still have this sneaker netting of data back and forth. And so Stuxnet knew a couple things. One, the authors of Stuxnet, one of the vulnerabilities they wanted to take advantage of, they knew was well-known and should have been patched, but SCADA infrastructure doesn't really get patched, right? Because you need this stuff to be up and running all the time. You don't want it to be broken or down for any period of time. And because it's not connected to the internet, people don't worry about patching things. So that's one thing. But another thing, was they put this, the attack was designed to travel by USB stick, so they put it in the environment, right, somehow, who knows, put it in the environment around the target such that it would eventually make its way via USB into the target. Now, another thing about it was that it almost certainly looks like it had lawyers looking at this attack, because a USB stick was only supposed to infect 3 machines, and it was an infected machine was only supposed to stay contagious for 21 days, and then in June, I think, of next year, the program is supposed to delete itself, right? So it doesn't last forever. However, this is a great lesson for us that the air gap is not inviolable, right? It is in fact somewhat of an imaginary river to cross. So between WikiLeaks and Stuxnet, both of them are significant, and both of them keep politicians probably up late at night. But I think that Stuxnet is the winner in this particular debate because it essentially crossed a threshold. It may not be a revolution as much as it is a revelation. My suspicion is that professional hackers, you know, within intelligence services, this is not the first time they have seen such an attack. But for the public, the rest of us, the normal people, this is quite a revolution. You know, this kind of attack, which is intended to achieve military results. What are military results? Military results, if you talk to, you know, lawyers on the law of armed conflict, for instance, I mean, somebody's got to die, or there has to be significant physical damage. But if you think about the implications for such cyber attacks, you know, can you imagine that you could accomplish a strategic objective with no casualties, no collateral damage, no sparking a wider war? I mean, if the Israeli Air Force, again for the 3rd time, had bombed this target and left a big smoking hole in the ground, you can only imagine that very short order, you know, there would be missiles flying and people dying in multiple countries in the Middle East and perhaps beyond. But if the centrifuges just stop working, it's much more difficult to effect a response in the physical world. It's just, it's a fact, and it's from a historical perspective, I think that Stuxnet has showed us quite a lot. So I think the pen is more powerful than ever. There's no one who would disagree with the fact that the entire world, if you're an author, is your potential audience. There's a great case. A guy gave me a good book recently, Metro 2033, which is very, very popular in Russia. This author, young author, wrote this science fiction novel, and he couldn't find anyone to publish it in Moscow. So he just thought, well, my last resort is to put it on the internet. And he put it on the internet, and it became so popular in Russia that now he's got, you know, obviously book deals lined up, video games, and movies as well. So no one is going to dispute the fact that, you know, the pen is more powerful than ever, but I believe that the sword has somehow gaining ground on it, right? And we should all be worried about the state of our security on planet Earth when, you know, nuclear weapons literally can destroy the planet. In this case, according to the New York Times, Stuxnet is the best counterproliferation op that the West has against Iran today. Most effective. IAEA has said 2,000 centrifuges physically destroyed. So I think that this has implications for us. This strategic hacking into national critical infrastructures of your adversary or your rival, these are things that have to begin today. And one of the differences, so I saw Michael Hayden. This was last year, Black Hat's keynote talk, right? He said, why might it be possible, or might be a better idea, or okay, to bomb a factory but not hack it? And nobody said anything. And he said, the reason is because you can choose to bomb a factory tomorrow, but you cannot choose to hack a factory tomorrow. Hacking, in fact, takes months and months of subversion, hard work, and undermining the security of your target. So he said, take, you know, the electricity supply of Paris or Moscow or New York, These are targets that have to begin to be attacked today in peacetime. He says, so in theory, you're going to have 43 intelligence services trying to undermine the electricity supply to a potential rival or potential combatant, in warfare. And he said, this is just not a good idea for anyone. And so I think you can imagine that, one, sites of strategic significance need to be on guard today. They need to be thinking today that they might be a target by intelligence services, terrorist groups that are seeking to undermine their security today in the event that there is some scenario which may arise that would threaten conflict. And then also, I think that this mutually assured disruption in cyberspace that's talked about, it could lead to arms control treaties. So I had just published a book before I left the Cyber Center in Estonia, in which I looked at these four likely national strategies to mitigate the cyber threat from a strategic perspective. This is you're not in charge of 1 or 100 or even 1,000 computers, but if you're looking at it from a national perspective, I look at the art of war and its sort of impact on military doctrine around the world. And I wrote a paper, kind of outlining how here's the art of war and here's cyber war. Where's the piece that is that is of cyber that is kind of outside of our traditional understanding of good military doctrine? I look at deterrence. So the good thing about deterrence and arms control and such, these are very mature topics. These are topics that we really understand well, especially from the Cold War. So with deterrence, you sort of have two strategies. There's denial and there is punishment. So denial means that I'm going to prevent you from acquiring the technology that you need to threaten me, right? And that's really difficult in cyberspace, right? Because conferences like this, for example, in which you can learn hacking. So then the second thing is punishment. And then the two really crucial aspects of cyber attacks and cybersecurity, and with this attribution problem and the asymmetry problem of cyber attacks, both of them really chip away at the credibility of deterrence by punishment. So that's hard. IPv6 I look at from the standpoint of technology. Is it possible to invest in technology such that you make the problem go away? Because technology is just only getting more complex and more diverse and more difficult to secure. But I think one good example of a technology that may be a game changer is IPv6. Right? Because there's a lot of problems with IPv4. IPv6 is going to try and correct them by making IPsec and good encryption, authentication sort of defined within the protocol. So I look at that issue. And then arms control. And arms control is something I think, just as General Hayden said last year, we may have to look at. A non-aggression treaty in cyberspace, or a limitation on cyber weapons, pledges not to attack financial infrastructure, critical infrastructure. These are things that I can imagine. Why? Because all of us are vulnerable, right? And I think we see that in this case that came out yesterday in the news of the drone program in the United States. There is a virus that they can't get rid of, right, in the drone program. And that also is an example of network that should have been air-gapped, that should have been, had a high level of protection. But I think, in fact, what it shows is that no one is secure, right? Because all of us rely on operating systems and applications, protocols, services that have vulnerabilities. And if attackers spend enough time and effort targeting you personally or your organization, they're going to find a way to get in because these things are so complicated. These things are difficult to secure because they are so complicated. So there's the book. It's a free download. All the best things in life are free, by the way. And so this is on the Cyber Center website. You can feel free to download it if you like. And even if you want a hard copy, you can send me an email, and maybe I can send you a hard copy of the book. And essentially what I'm looking at is trying to look at cybersecurity from a strategic perspective. And think about, if you were a national security advisor to the head of your government, what would you recommend? And I think all those four strategies, in fact, they each will be tried by governments. You're going to have to try and alter your doctrine. you're going to have to try and deter, whether it's only through threats of law enforcement or public disclosure of an attack. You're going to have to try these four and more. These are not, of course, the only four you could try, but that's what I look at in the book. So many thanks for your time. I think I've got down to 1 minute, so I appreciate it. I'd be happy over coffee outside to take any questions, but I assume we need to move on to the coffee break. It's up to you.
You're talking about centrifuges. My name is Charles Moreira. I'm representing PC.com magazine. You're talking about the mechanism by which they destroyed centrifuges. You mentioned Hertz. Now, sorry, what did the PLC do to? What did this Stuxnet cause the Hertz in the centrifuge? Isn't it RPM?
Right. So my understanding is, you have a technician who's at a computer that is using what? It's using Windows, right? Mm-hmm. But on that system is software, step 7, developed by Siemens, right, in order to talk to the PLC. And the PLC is kind of a middleman that's telling the infrastructure what to do, right? So, the engineer is saying, okay, I need you to spin at 1,064 hertz, right?
Hang on, revolutions per minute or hertz? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not a nuclear engineer, I apologize. But I understand that it's 1,064 hertz. And at some level, that translates into a number of revolutions per minute, or there's another word for it, I apologize, in terms of a nuclear centrifuge, however, the speed at which the material is turning in the centrifuge. And so, and that's to divide the 235 and the 238, right? And so you want to scoop the 235 out, and that's the whole point of the enrichment process. And so basically, what I understand is that you want to spin the machine too fast and then too slow. And because of the extreme sensitivity of this material, you will in fact destroy the machine if you're not running it properly.
So was the programmable logic controller making the fella go from 1.4, well, whatever hertz, kilohertz down to some, what was the slow speed you mentioned? I lost that.
Again, I wanted to be careful because one of the sources I said said 2 hertz and the other one said a few hundred. So I'm not sure. But in any case, it was too fast and then too slow, not at the speed that it should be going on.
And that damaged the thing?
That's right. It would, in effect, destroy the machine. And so the IAEA, evidently through its on-site cameras there, saw the removal of about 1,000 machines, I think. And so it's speculated that Stuxnet was the cause, because it occurred about the same time that Stuxnet was active.
Now, would it have been more secure if they had used open source software, say like Linux? I mean, if the Iranians had been using Linux instead of Windows.
Sure, why not? I think.
I mean, the thing is, fair enough. Maybe an average computer virus might not attack. It might not be designed to attack. Most computer viruses are not designed to attack within a Linux PC. But when it's in the hands of somebody with highly technical people with a highly specific strategic purpose, I mean, is Linux more secure than Windows in that respect?
That's right. I think if you look around the world, you'll see that various governments, Red Flag Linux in China, and Germany was very interested in Linux. And not only from a financial perspective, you don't have to pay Microsoft, but you can perhaps configure it in a unique fashion, right? Sure, why not? I think probably you'd want to diversify your infrastructure in order to make it more difficult for an attacker. I mean, we have this problem within the U.S. government. Everyone wants to standardize the system. Everyone should be on the same operating system, and everyone should have the same type of password, and so on and so forth. And what they've discovered over time is that allows hackers, potentially, if they can get in, then they have access to much, much more than they had access to previously, when you had thousands of different kinds of networks, before you went to one network. Right? And so there's always a trade-off between, security, functionality, and usability. And this is one case, in which, there's no perfect calculation of risk here. But I would certainly recommend, if you're just asking me personally, that they diversify somewhat, or that they try to have a unique environment. And I'm sure they're trying to do that. for sure, but it's perhaps not easy. Everybody wants to use Windows because the users are familiar with it and they know how to use it. And you put them on a Linux machine, they may not feel comfortable, etc. But in this case, it could be that the Siemens software works on Windows only, you know, and that they're stuck in Iran with using industrial control system software that only is compatible with Windows. I don't know. Is there another question?
Was the programmable logic controller running Windows?
Yes.
The PLC was running Windows. It was running must be an embedded Windows.
The PLC, I'm not sure, but originally that's right. It was Windows at the workstation.
No, it's short.
All right, we'll have one last short question and then we'll adjourn.
I'll meet you later.
Sure.
Yeah, you mentioned that with the Stuxnet, it basically turned how we understand malware on its head, with it being a more directed attack. And you've also mentioned that we've started having multilateral agreements with organizations such as NATO on how to defend against these threats. But apart from basically just words and policies, do we have, or is any organization or state actually starting to implement something on the ground to actually counter these emergent threats? Or do we have something like that in the works at the moment?
At the international level?
Well, it would be nice if it's at an international level or even at the local level, if you would know any particular state or player that is already starting to address this beyond simply agreements with one another.
The critical infrastructure threat.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, well, in the United States, I think like the U.S. CERT now, I think has a new body that's only focused on critical infrastructure. Really, all this has been starting since 1996, I believe, in the United States. President Bill Clinton had this thing called PDD 63, Presidential Decision Directive 63, which named critical infrastructure, you know, and there was 8 elements to it. You know, there was oil and gas, and there was electronic infrastructure, and there was, et cetera. And trying to look at it from a national security perspective and protecting these 8 sectors of the economy. So that, you know, there's a lot going on. I think the U.S. was a little bit ahead of the game on this. But from what I've seen, ever since Stuxnet, I saw in the paper last week that the number of vulnerabilities discovered within critical infrastructure is doubling since Stuxnet. So it has the attention now of hackers and of vulnerability researchers. So, you know, I think there's a lot of work to do. You know, we're just at the beginning, I think. We had, at the Cyber Center last year, we had over 100 engineers at the Swedish equivalent of DARPA. We put together an environment of 7 electricity plants, and we ran a scenario. We had 20 hackers, and they had the red team, and there were 7 blue teams from different countries in Europe, and they basically tried to attack the critical infrastructure. And so, you know, so I have a paper on that published by Cal Berkeley. And basically what we discovered was the hackers were quite good at getting into the infrastructure in the first place. They weren't so good at understanding control systems. But the thing is that militaries and intelligence organizations, they can bridge that gap, right? They can put the same people in the room. Somebody's an expert on vulnerabilities, somebody on exploits, somebody on encryption, and then the engineers in the room that understand the control systems. If you can put that group together in the room, then all of a sudden you can have a national security threat. But that's the kind of thing that a lone hacker or even a terrorist organization might not be able to do. I think that terrorist organizations are still more fearful of the internet than they are trying to exploit it. And that's why, for instance, in Abbottabad, you know, at Osama bin Laden's compound, they didn't have telephone or internet access, you know, because they feared the connectivity. But there's a huge gulf between you know, a nation state and everybody else in this game. But as we've seen with Anonymous, boy, you can affect international affairs even as a non-state actor if it's only on the semantic level or the WikiLeaks information provision level.
Thank you very much, Kenneth. We'll have to continue further questions on the floor. Feel free to approach Kenneth
Sure.
during the coffee break, which we're having right now.